Okay, I think it's 4 minutes past 3, so let's make a start. If I just do the first slide in terms of a quick moment for housekeeping, just want to make everyone aware that this event will be recorded and will be uploaded publicly on YouTube for the benefit of others. And the full privacy notice is available on the Connecting Leeds Transport Strategy website. We were expecting a few more attendees, but even so, with the numbers we've got, all microphones and video viewers will be turned off. To ask questions, which obviously we're encouraging, please use the Q&A function within Zoom. We will endeavour to answer majority of questions during the session, and any unanswered questions will be published on the frequently asked questions page of the Commonplace website. We retain the right to remove any participants during the session who post materials that contain potentially offensive and discriminatory content. We do not accept obscenities or insults, and posting of such materials will also result in removal from the session. For any further inquiries, please contact the Connecting Leeds Transport Strategy team at transport.strategy@leeds.gov.uk. Okay, Finney, are you going to do the slides? Okay. So I think if I say a few words, I think I'm handing over then to Nigel Foster to take us through the beginning, and then a few of us will then interject with our slides. But we intend to keep the presentation fairly short, maximum of 30 minutes, so that we leave a good 30 minutes for Q&A. The panel comprises Councillor Lisa Mulheron, Executive Member for Climate Change, Transport and Sustainable Development, myself, Gary Bartlett, Chief Officer of Highways and Transportation, Paul Foster, Transport Strategy Manager, and Nigel Foster, no relation to Paul, but for Consulting Chair of Leeds Transport Advisory Panel. And the Q&A session will be chaired by Nigel Foster. So firstly, from me, thank you for everybody for showing an interest in this first webinar on the transport strategy that we're drafting. Obviously, it's a learning exercise for us, and there are further events, and if it doesn't go quite perfectly to plan, hopefully you'll bear with us and we'll improve for the next one. So does that take us on to...
Yeah, thank you, Gary. That's a great start. I think we go on to the next slide, please, Finn. And I think it's now, I'm going to hand over to Councillor Mulheron. I think she's going to take us through the vision and the vision for Leeds and what that means for mobility.
Thank you very much, Nigel, and welcome to everybody who's joining us today. Really great to have as many people as possible involved in learning about, discussing and contributing to our draft transport strategy for Leeds. As you can see from the first slide there, we have a vision of a city where you don't need a car. And that's a city that's come an awful long way since the 1960s and early 70s when we were the motorway city. So I know that for some people that statement, which is a bold and ambitious statement, creates some concern. This is not about being anti-car. This is about giving people alternatives, affordable, accessible, zero carbon choice in how they move about the city. So this means a city where people can walk and cycle easily and safely, particularly on those shorter journeys. And we know that lots of people are already doing that. We need to be doing more of that. And we've learned a lot through the last year, the importance of people using local amenities and walking and cycling safely to do that. And then for longer journeys, for them to have a range of choice, both public transport, but also a wider range now of mobility solutions, from car clubs, car sharing, to being able to use demand responsive transport to get from door to door for those who are less able-bodied. And then we want to ensure that there's equal access to those opportunities and those choices for everyone. So whether people are struggling financially, we want to ensure that the choices are affordable, but also so that everybody of every ability can access a range of transport solutions. We want to ensure that we have efficient means of getting around, and we want to ensure that the way in which we change our city is going to help us to reduce carbon emissions and meet our climate targets. And just that last point there again, to be very clear that this is about giving people choice. So how does this fit with our existing strategies? So we have in the city an inclusive growth strategy and a joint health and wellbeing strategy. And from 2019, we declared a climate emergency as well. We've got very ambitious targets in terms of carbon reduction. Those targets are evidence-led, they are based on the science, and ones that have been produced in line with our colleagues at the Leeds Climate Commission. So research-led that's internationally recognised in terms of what we have to do locally to contribute to both the national and global targets for reducing carbon emissions. In terms of inclusive growth, we want to ensure that everybody can move about the city in an affordable way, and also that we're linking people up to jobs and opportunities from where they live. And in terms of improving health and well-being, we know the impact that air quality has on people's well-being. We also know that physical activity is essential to tackle some of the worst physical and mental health challenges that we have. So if we can deliver on this strategy, we can help to improve inclusive growth and improve health outcomes for citizens in Leeds and play our part in terms of tackling the climate emergency. I think at this point we're handing over to Gary, but he needs to unmute himself.
Someone had to do it, didn't they? So apologies for that. As Councillor Mulheron has said, the city has changed a great deal in recent years. Certainly when I first came to Leeds in the late 80s, 90s, it's changed a great deal since those days. It's changed a great deal in the last 10 years and is going to change a great deal in the next decade or so. But if you look at some of the trends in travel, you can see some of the scale of the task before us. And there's just some stats there that we've put up that we thought you would find interesting. So 56% of trips by car are less than 5 miles long, and 77% are less than 10 miles long by car. 23% of all trips by car are 10 miles or more, account for only 23% of those car trips, but 68% of total distance driven. So that's quite a significant stat, and it's these longer trips which are going to be the hardest to transfer to active modes. So it's those longer distance commuting trips into Leeds that are of concern. And 79% of total distance travelled is by car within West Yorkshire. Quite a staggering fact. Having said that, though, 81% of trips, short trips, are already by foot. So that is something to build on. So it's not all gloom and doom. As we know, Leeds, gateway to the north, it serves as a local, regional and national hub. It's well served by motorways, strategic road network and railways. And it's led to, in many respects, why we had this motorway city of the 70s. There's still much more investment that is needed, particularly on the railways, and the council and its partners continue to push for improvements such as High Speed 2 and Northern Powerhouse Rail. That's at a national and regional level, and so we continue to push hard for those improvements. But we've also looked and sought improvements at a local level, and there's been significant improvement in recent years and significant investment, which I'm just going to quickly talk you through now. We've particularly done a lot of work in terms of rolling out 20-mile-an-hour zones and limits across the city in residential streets. We've initiated quality bus initiatives on certain corridors, and the A65 is one that springs to mind. We've also done a significant amount of segregated cycle tracks across the city in recent years. Much more still to be done, but some movement in the right direction. We've also taken advantage of funding when it's come our way, And we've also initiated temporary measures when we've had the opportunity as well. And through emergency active travel funding in recent months, we have protected some of our cycle routes along key corridors by using something that's called Orca and Wands. And there's an example there of the A660. And we've also done similar facilities on the A65, providing segregated cycle routes to ensure safety for cyclists. We've also widened footways in the last 6 months or so to help with social distancing, which has been of benefit. Obviously, we've promoted 20 mile an hour out schools for many years, but we've also promoted school streets projects in recent months. And this is about protecting youngsters, children getting to and from school by, if you like, moving the priority to them having precedence over other traffic in the locality around the school. And these being very popular, and many calls for these to be expanded across other schools across the city. These are a couple examples of projects that are in play at the moment. Certainly more cycling schemes, and I would draw out the one City Connect 3 adjacent to Ellen Road is making good progress. But you may have also, if you've been into the city, seen the one near the arena on Clay Pit Lane. Significant investment in recent years has been related to the local Leeds Public Transport Investment Programme. And in the bottom right hand corner there, you can see work on the A61 South bus corridor. So there's a number of corridors that are being worked on, this being one, A647 being another, and A61 North being another, where we're trying to promote public transport, cycling and walking on these key corridors into the city. That represents a significant investment. I think in totality, it's something like £200 million of investment into the city, into these gateways and corridors when you put all the various pots of money together. There's a couple of examples there where we are trying to improve the lot for public transport, cycling, walking, enhance public realm in these areas as well. In areas, particularly if I think of Park Row, where there's huge, in normal circumstances, pedestrian footfall, but the footways are very narrow. And so by providing facilities for public transport, cycling, but also enhancing the public realm for pedestrians, we're seeing a significant change in the landscape of the city centre. And if you haven't been to the city centre in recent months, I think when we all go back, everybody will notice the change. And just a couple of examples again, the top left-hand corner is Corn Exchange Works, key public transport interchange in the city centre, where work has started in recent weeks. And this is about significantly improving public realm around a very important building in the city, but also improving the public interchange, which sees thousands upon thousands of people using it day in, day out in normal circumstances. But it's about improving the public realm, cycling and walking facilities too, as well as the public transport and public realm. As many of you will know, we've done a lot of work around Park and Ride in recent years, starting with Ellen Road and then Temple Green to the east of Leeds. This example here is Sturton Park and Ride that's under construction and well underway, and will hopefully be operational sometime later in this year. And it's part of this Leeds Public Transport Investment Programme. So I think the message I want to get across here is that there's a lot of work that has been going on in recent years. There's a lot that's on site now, and there's a lot more that is planned in the future. So it is exciting times, but we do not underestimate the challenge that we face. So I think at that point, I'll pass over to Paul to take you through more detail of the draft transport strategy. Thanks,
Gary. Okay, so to support the strategy, we've set ourselves some very ambitious targets that we've put out in draft here. As Councillor Mulheron noted, there's a climate emergency target for Leeds to be carbon neutral by 2030, which is some 20 years ahead of national targets and 8 years ahead of the sort of West Yorkshire target. What that means is obviously we're working in a more challenging timescale, and the need for a reduction in travel and a remoding of travel in terms of a reduction in the use of internal combustion engine vehicles and into lower carbon forms of transports is essential to sort of meet that timescale, and that's part of what we're looking at. So we're looking at a reduction in travel through better planning of the city, both in terms of how we develop new areas of the city and the services as well that we offer in the city and how far people have to travel to get to them. But then also looking at technology, you know, obviously previously this would have been an event, we'd have all traveled to it, and so, you know, that change in working patterns that has happened through COVID is likely to continue, and we need that to continue to help reduce some of that travel demand in the city. We've also set ourselves a target around road safety. In 2019, there were over 350 collisions that involved a killed or seriously injured casualty within them, and we've set and adopting a policy of Vision Zero, which is looking to completely eliminate those injuries by 2040. So that's a huge target for us, but one we really need to work with partners to deliver in terms of sort of enforcement, education, and changing the road infrastructure to make that safer for everyone. We have then, so in terms of the scale of the challenge that set us, if we currently carried on, this is specifically in terms of the carbon, if we carried on with our current projections, we'd probably get to about a 17% reduction in CO2. The work that we've set out in the strategy, which would require a significant amount of funding and policy backing from everyone, from national government through to individuals choosing to make some of these changes, could get us to about 43 to 50% reduction in carbon. So we still need to do more, and what we've put in the strategy is some alternative ideas, some more ideas about what we can do to further and reach that target of net carbon. And we really, through this consultation, want to hear people's views on those measures and anything else they feel we need to do to reach those targets. Okay. So we are going to do a series of webinars on each of these big moves or areas of focus. So I'm not going to go into an awful lot of detail on that here on that. There's an awful lot more that you can read in the document, and I welcome people to do that and engage in the consultation. And we're going to go into the detail of each of those later. But really, what we were looking at here is how we can make those alternatives that Councillor Mulheron talked about for every journey that we make in the city. You know, we all travel for work, to visit friends, to take our children places, to visit healthcare, etc. You know, the multitude of journeys that we all take, and what we've got to do is look at how we can get a low carbon alternative for all those measures, one that makes it healthier, makes the economy work better in the city, and effectively makes us more efficient. So we've looked at that whole broad spectrum of journeys, and we feel that we've covered an idea of how we can improve each one of those and give you a viable alternative for each of those. So just a quick, we obviously talked about decarbonising transport, and that's about reducing the amount we travel, remoding to lower forms, and then decarbonising those vehicles that are essential and those journeys that people are essential, looking at electric and hydrogen and all the other technologies that are zero carbon at the point of impact. Obviously, there's a lot of work to do nationally as well around the grid and where you get the energy from in the first place, but that would be transport's part in that. Healthier streets, space and communities. This is very much about those local level interventions. Gary talked about 20-mile-an-hour zones, but going that bit further and looking at how we can make that sort of 20-minute neighbourhood concept work, how we can really encourage walking and cycling, and everyone can access and feel safe in their local community, and really build that level. We're then looking at the transforming the city centre, which Gary again has highlighted the work we've already started on that. But that again is making a place people want to live, work and visit, that has that environment and the streetscapes that are fitting for Leeds as it moves forward this century. In terms of enhancing public transport, that target that we've got there of 130% increase in bus use, for instance, you know, we have to increase the capacity, the frequency, the times of day, and the range of destinations that public transport serves. And there's a number of measures set out in the strategy towards getting there, working with colleagues at the combined authority and the bus operators and the rail operators, etc., to improve that level. New mobility solutions is all about how we can utilize technology and have different services on the network that we've already got. So this isn't about building things, to start offering different range of services, from, you know, car clubs, making that shared bike hire, e-bike hire, scooters, even if that becomes something that's adopted in this country and brought forward, and having those alternatives along with demand responsive transport, which is like minibuses that are a bit like private hire but multiple occupancy, but again run as a public transport service, and then obviously taxis and private hire play their part as well in that service, as well as then looking at freight and logistics and how we can, you know, influence that and make that more efficient and less impactful across the city. To do all that as well, you need to look at payments, and there's a bit of work in there around payments for that. And then finally on this page, you may have seen recently the Combined Authority have released details of their plans for a mass transit network across the region, and we've fully been engaged in that and support that going forward. And that's a really important piece of work to fill that gap where the rail and bus network, where there's not enough capacity on the buses, but maybe we haven't got the rail networks in place in those areas, and it is a vital part of taking it forward. Okay, I think so. I think that's it for me. I just want to hand over to Nigel now, who's been chairing our advisory panel, who've helped us develop this strategy.
Thank you, Paul. I'll be brief because I know there's some questions already in the chat, and people will want to get those across to us. So why did the council set up the Transport Advisory Panel? Well, they wanted to get expertise and experience from outside of Leeds to test out some of the things it was thinking about doing. So we've got a wide range within our panel. It's very experienced people in there, and they come from mainly outside of Leeds, but we do have people within the panel who are from Leeds within the education and healthcare sectors, and also within the local community. And I think what's also important is to recognise there's an ongoing transport conversation. One of the probably the biggest ongoing transport conversation of its type in the country. And the aim of that is to gather the views of local people, of businesses in the city, to make sure we're taking into account their views. We also work very closely with partners in the city, whether it's bus and rail operators, as Paul has said, or whether it's businesses, or whether it's with national government and the Combined Authority. And the aim is to get a balanced set of policies and measures that meet the future needs of the city and how it might develop over time. Next slide, Paul. I think as part of the work of the panel, we've looked at very specific projects, such as the plans for the growth of the station. But importantly, we've also identified what are some of the key challenges for the city and what the transport strategy that the council is developing will need to address. And as Councillor Mulheron said, you know, some of these are really big items that one needs to consider, in particular climate change. And we've heard from Paul and Gary the challenges that the not just Leeds face, but the country as a whole faces, and the ambition that Councillor Mulheron set out about how we might tackle this and become net zero carbon by 2030. And transport, as you know, has got a major role to play in addressing those reduction in emissions. But we've also been hit over the last 12 months with the COVID-19 pandemic, and that's taken a lot of attention for the council in the short term in thinking about, well, what does that mean for travel in Leeds? How are people going to get about in the future? You know, what's the views on public transport, and how might we develop the aims around a 15-minute city, and what does that mean for travel and the travel choices that are available to people? So we want to make sure that as part of the strategy that the city is inclusive and accessible for everybody. Whatever their needs are, whatever their ability to move around the city is, and whatever choice of travel that they choose to make their journey. And so we're thinking about how does that work, and how is that integrated, and how can that be a balanced set of solutions that meet those needs. And within that, we've also got to try and take into account what the future of mobility looks like, and that's quite an interesting set of challenges. And we've seen some of those around in Leeds already. Gary's shown some of the examples about how to encourage more people walking and cycling, but actually, how do car clubs fit into that? How do we provide active travel hubs or mobility hubs? What's the role of micro-mobility, or how do we deal with increasing numbers of deliveries currently predominantly on the road, mainly by vehicles, but some of it's by bicycle, and in the future there are plans for potentially delivering them by drones. And so we need to try and work these different challenges and different demands into a strategy that will work over the next 10 years and deliver the sort of city that Lisa outlined in the ambitions that the council have set for Leeds. So on that note, I think that's enough from me. I'm going to go take the opportunity to hand over to our participants, and we'll go through to some questions. So first one we've got is from Moira Flynn, and she's raised the interesting challenge about us versus them, cyclists versus car users versus bus users. And I think it's an interesting challenge. You've seen some of the measures that Leeds have been looking at, but Paul, any thoughts on that from you?
Yeah, no, I think she's absolutely right about that approach. That and what we're trying to set out here is that everyone chooses the mode of transport that's right for the journey that they're doing. So yeah, as we all become more multimodal, it's a bit of transport jargon about it, isn't it? So I travel by bike. I've got a car. I drive that. Sometimes I go on the bus, and I use rail to go places as well. And I think that's what we, the more people who do use those different modes for different journeys, the more acceptance there is of each other when we're doing that. I quite often don't like to use the term cyclist. I prefer it's person on a bike, isn't it? It does need to be seen that way. I think that's something there. I think it's also interesting, Moira's question, and a number of other people have picked the point up around affordability of public transport and buses in particular. I think that's probably one to discuss, Nigel.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. Gary, I think there's one here that relates to what Paul's just been talking about the different choices of transport that we've got. And I think you outlined it in what you were saying. There's a lot going on in the city. How do we make sure that we have integrated schemes that are complementary, but they're not competing, whether that's about competing in terms of choices that might be unnecessary, or in competing in terms of how do we construct them and make sure that we keep the city moving and avoid gridlock?
No, thanks, Nigel. It's a good question, and it's something that we've been working on over the last 18 months or so in a group that's called Planning for Growth, because we have a lot of our own work that's taking place in the city at the moment. So that's been a challenge in terms of coordinating that. But also there's lots of other work by whether it's utility companies or developments that are taking place. So there's a way that we've developed where we correlate, or we gather all that information, and then we plan our works around it. And if there are clashes, we see if we can mitigate it, or we can just delay schemes slightly to avoid major clashes. I think it's fair to say that we've been fairly successful at doing that. We've avoided some clashes. We've actually brought some work forward so that the other work can take advantage of road closures, for example, which is of benefit to the whole city and to the various partners involved. It's also fair to say that obviously with more significant schemes coming on stream, hopefully, like the ones mentioned in the question, it will be more of a challenge. Yeah, it'd be nice to think that at some point we would have a mass transit scheme, HS2 and Northern Powers Rail and Transpennine route upgrade all taking place in some form, and that will bring some significant challenge to how it's all coordinated. But we have a system that's in place now. It's working well, and certainly other authorities that have heard of it are asking us questions about what we do and how we do it, so they can learn those lessons. So I think we have the start of something there that we are deploying now and we can build on.
That's great. Thanks, Gary. Lisa, I've got a couple of difficult ones here, and I thought I'd save those for you, if that's okay, because they're about choices around funding. And I've grouped them together. There's some around the choices of funding and how that's paid for in terms of the interventions. And then the other one, which is how do we make sure that we're creating spaces and places that are safe for people, whether that's safe in terms of their mobility or safe in terms of their activities around the city. And I thought, given you're the cabinet member for transport and climate change, or is it regeneration and climate change? I can't remember the exact title, but I thought you'd be the best person to answer that question.
Thanks, Nigel. So you asked me about safety, and what was the other question?
The other one was about how we spend our money. I mean, clearly, none of this comes for free. We've got quite a good settlement from government in terms of the public transport investment programme. But there's questions about, should we be spending money in the way we're planning, given we're in a pandemic? And will the council tax be a factor in all of this, or how will we raise the money to make sure we've got the investment we need?
Thank you. So the question about money and how we prioritise spend is always a political question. So that's why it's ended up with me. I think it's important to note that the council tax is not the money that we're spending on this. The council tax is the money that we spend on keeping elderly people safe, providing care for them at home, providing support for schools, for keeping the potholes filled on our road in part, but some of that money also comes from central government. In terms of the investments in public transport, we do give some money to West Yorkshire Combined Authority to subsidise services that, for instance, provide cheaper travel for children and older people. But we also subsidise routes that wouldn't otherwise operate into the evenings and at weekends. Now, when we did the big climate conversation, we asked people for their feedback, and there was a lot of concern around public transport provision. And again, when we ran the Citizens Jury in partnership with the Leeds Climate Commission and partners at the university, the number one priority for the citizens of Leeds that came out of the Citizens Jury process was bringing public transport back into public ownership. And that was because people were concerned about the way in which decisions were made in terms of public transport and how effective they were in their areas, whether or not it was getting to deliver the services that they needed, and also the cost of those services. And clearly we had our public transport system, which is our main public transport system in Leeds, the buses, deregulated in 1986, and we're still seeing the consequences of that. And although we have got a much improved relationship with bus operators, which has really come on leaps and bounds in the last couple of years in terms of the partnership that we've created, I think there's still a question really about whether they are investing the money that they get as well as they could do to provide a public transport service, and how much of that money actually goes to shareholders. So I think in terms of spend on bus services, in terms of how much the fares are for people, whether or not it is cost effective for families. I've seen on the chats concerns about the price for a whole family to travel on the bus. That is very much currently a decision made by bus operators rather than the publicly run authorities in the city. So there are a number of ways of dealing with that. Clearly, the Citizens Jury's desire to see a publicly owned public transport system is one. Franchising is another, which is an option that becomes more available to us when we get a mayoral authority after the elections, hopefully in May this year. And continuing improvements from bus operators working with us in partnership is the other way of delivering that. So I think for me, I think I would agree with the comments on the chat function that there is a need to make those services more affordable to people and to make them more responsive to the needs that people have got in terms of their transport. And some of the ideas in terms of the mobility solutions that were picked up earlier, for instance, demand responsive transport, are an attempt to respond to that. So in my ward, which is on the outskirts of Leeds and is quite poorly served except for one route, which is the main flagship route between Leeds and Wakefield, most of the other villages that I represent are quite poorly served by public transport. And for an older person to access the GP practice, for instance, if they're travelling from West Ardsley to Tingley to get to the only local GP in the area, it can be a 2-hour round trip to get there by bus. And that means coming back via Wakefield in some cases to avoid sitting at a cold bus stop for a very long period of time to get the connection back. And that's not really the way in which we want public services to run. So a demand responsive service would enable older people to book a door-to-door transport from their home to the GP surgery and to book that service back again without the wait in the cold and without having to go completely around the houses on a very lengthy journey to get there and back. So I think there's ways of looking at how we spend that money. Some of that is in our hands and some of that's in the provider's hands. And in terms of safety, we've had, I think, a number of things to say there really. The safety for the public servants who are actually providing those services. We've seen, for instance, the impact of COVID on some of the public transport providers, bus drivers up and down the country, particularly private hire taxi drivers affected, and how we support them, keep them safe, and how they then also support the public to keep safe. And we've got a big job to do in terms of restoring public confidence, and we want to see that happen quite quickly when we come back out of the pandemic. And we're very keen to work with providers to do that. And I think the other thing, I think the question actually in the chat was more about how people are assured about safety walking around the city. Now that again breaks down into a number of different elements, doesn't it? There's the focus on this transport strategy in terms of Vision Zero and how we tackle road safety issues. How do we make it safer for people to walk about, to get across the road safely, to get around our city without feeling that they're cut off by major roads. For instance, if you're walking from some of the city areas in the south of Leeds to get to the city centre for work, it's a short distance, but it doesn't feel like a short or safe distance with the current road layout. But with the work that we're doing, for instance, to create routes through the new city centre park and the connections that we're building in around where the University Technical College, the Printworks campus and some of the local school provision in that part of the city is located, that's going to become a much safer, more attractive journey to walk and cycle in the future. So it's how we do that, and we're trying to look around the city centre core, mile and a half radius of how we make those journeys in particular easier for people to walk and cycle, because that's the sort of length of journey we think that people can make through active travel, and that can be through the mobility means as well for those who aren't able to walk and cycle as such, but could be using mobility scooters and so on, but making that journey safer and more attractive for them. And I guess the final element would be around community safety, which is again working with our partners in neighbourhood policing teams who've also been hit by funding cuts, as we know, and we work very closely with them and local community groups to try to support local community safety initiatives. But we do really need to see our neighbourhood policing teams getting the support that they need financially from the government as well.
That's Lisa, that's fantastic. I asked you some awkward questions and you gave a very, very comprehensive and broad-ranging response, which it shows you why you're the cabinet member for this area. So thank you for that. One of the things we've had a request is to try and get Hilary on from the National Federation of the Blind in the UK Leeds branch. Finn, were you able to do anything about that?
Right, hopefully, Nigel. Just bear with me 2 moments, if that's all right.
maybe just while we're waiting for Hilary to come on, I think one of the other comments that's got a lot of support in the Q&A function was around the proportion of Leeds residents that don't have access to a car, and we know that, and that's one of the key reasons why we're keen to support alternative modes of travel, not only for those who might choose not to use the car that's sitting on their drive, but for those who don't have access to a car as well.
I think that's a really good point, Lisa. I mean, what we're trying to do, as you said in the outset, is you don't need to have a car. If you choose to have one, you want to use it, or you need it for certain journeys, then that we should make sure that's available to you. But actually, we want to make sure all those choices are, and create that sort of active and vibrant city that some of the chat has mentioned around some of our continental neighbours. Finn, have you managed to sort that one out?
Hopefully so, Nigel.
Hilary, are you there with us? Do you want to ask your question?
Is she on mute?
Just while we're waiting, just see if we can get through to Hilary. If not, we will have to move on. But just while we're waiting, one of the things is we're capturing all of the chat. We're not just recording this and filming it. We are actually going to capture all of the chat as well, and then the team is going to put some responses available. I'm not sure if they're going to send back individually or they'll post it on the Connecting Leeds website. But we want to try and give a response to all of them, and some of them are actually more relevant. So if I have not picked one of the questions or points that you've raised, then it's probably because I think we're going to be able to pick them up in one of the subsequent webinars that Gary outlined that will be following this one. So one more chance for you, give Hilary another chance. Can you hear us, Hilary? And do you want to come in?
Yeah, yes, I can now. Thank you.
No problem. Do you want to ask your question?
I just wanted to know, when you go in all these cycle tracks, will there be, like you're doing on the hedgerow, will the road crossings, will the lights be correspondent with the cars, like you're doing on the hedgerow?
Gary,
because otherwise it's going to be very, very difficult for people like me, because I'm on the blind register, and also for people with prams and buggies and things.
Okay, Hilary,
I mean, if I'm crossing the road, say, and there's a cycle track in the way, I must admit, particularly with the younger generation, they don't. They think they've got priority, and they don't give way to blind people or, as I say, other elderly people. Will you be having the lights like you do, like you're putting in on the hedgerow?
So I'm going to go to Gary Bartlett. That's great, Hilary. Thank you for that question. I'm going to go to Gary Bartlett, who's leading on the design, who leads the design teams within Leeds for that project. Gary?
I may be deferring this one to Paul in terms of the very deep.
I saw that one coming. Yeah, so Hilary, we are. So Hilary, yes, we are looking at the designs of those, and so where you've got the crossings at points where there are, so for instance, your example of the hedgerow at the junction of the hedgerow and Park Row, there's obviously traffic signals that would stop the traffic,
yes.
And so where we have
the new ones that you're proposing.
Yeah, so where we have those, there will be a formal crossing point for pedestrians over the cycle track. So that might be the form of lights where the cyclist gets a red signal, or through a zebra crossing again where they have to give way to the pedestrians. So that's how we're going to address that in those locations. And obviously, when we're designing cycle tracks, etc., we're building those now to the latest standards. We're making sure that there's a discernible upstand between the cycle track and the footpath as well, so that blind users have got something where they know, therefore, that there's a change in the street. So there's a curb there between you know, however small, there's a curb that you can recognise. So I hope that reassures you. And yeah, it's something we do make sure we do with all our designs. We have we regularly meet with the access and usability group on our major schemes as well, to ensure that the designs we've got work for everyone.
Yeah, I thought I recognised your name.
Yeah, and
thank you.
Thank you for your question, Hilary. We also have Mary Naylor as part of our advisory panel, so we make sure that we do take into account the needs of all of our communities, and it's really important for us. So thank you for joining in and your question. Gary, as you managed to get off lightly a moment ago and pass it to Paul, there was this question about should we have a car specific policy within the strategy? So rather than just saying, well, we're looking at all the others, should we be having something more specific about what we're doing for cars?
That's an interesting question. We've made it very clear that this is not an anti-car strategy. We do want to promote and give priority to pedestrians, cyclists and public transport in the appropriate places. But for business, we do recognise that there will be some business elements that do need to access the city centre and our towns, and we will need to allow for that. So it is very much that it isn't anti-car. The purpose of these whole events is to test our draft strategy. And I noticed other questions on the chat about are the big moves challenging enough? Are they at the right scale? Well, that's what we want to hear people from. So without wishing to skirt around the question, it's an interesting question and something we can reflect on. But yeah, welcome the input.
I think to add to that, there was a question, wasn't it, about what's changed the most since the last strategy, and I think probably is that target where we're looking at a 30% reduction in traffic in car use. Previous strategies have always looked at, yes, we want the city to grow and there'll be more people living there and there'll be more journeys, and therefore we need to accommodate that growth through other means. But we've kind of kept the car neutral in previous iterations of strategies and policy, and I think that makes a real difference in how we therefore design our schemes and build our schemes and what are we planning for. We've done a little piece of work around, even if we got a 30% reduction across the city, would that be uniform on everywhere? So actually, when you look at that, you know, the inner ring road and the outer ring road, for instance, still with that 30% reduction, they don't see a 30% reduction. It's taken out of some of the more local areas. And so, yeah, we are looking at how that differential and what design standards and size of scheme we need to build in the future. So I think that's how we're looking at that question of a car strategy. I think we'll have some policies and design guidance that meet that target.
Thanks, Paul. Councillor Heron, just a question for you. I mean, one of the ones that Paul just picked up on and Gary picked up on was, are we bold enough in the strategy? Should we be going further? Should we be going faster? What's your thoughts on that?
I think this has been welcomed by some of the national commentators as the most ambitious and bold transport strategy they've ever seen from Leeds. So I don't think we could be criticised fairly as not being bold enough. I think a couple of questions there on the Q&A that we haven't picked up on, asking, for instance, will we trial active travel neighbourhoods? Well, we're actually doing that already in 2 communities in Leeds as part of the emergency active travel measures. So we are looking across the board at all the different things that we can do. And one of the things we're asking the public to do in response to this consultation is to tell us whether they think we've got this about right, whether they think we should go further. There's a range of measures that I think were touched upon in Paul's slides in terms of addressing the gap that we've got. So even if we do what we're setting out to do, we know that there will still be a challenge for us in meeting our carbon reduction targets. And that's something that we need to resolve. And whilst we look with the Climate Commission about the next steps on the climate emergency roadmap, we also need to be working with the public, because it's very challenging for people to consider moving around the city without a car. And for some of us, it will be more easy to do than others. But we need to really change the way in which we live our daily lives to do that. And one of the things really is ownership of a car. And if you have a car sat on your driveway, which you know, for most of us is the case at the moment, if we're having to work from home under the lockdown, it's just sat there not doing anything much of the time. You're making most of your journeys maybe locally just to get the kind of basic kind of food needs, and to get your daily exercise on foot, and your car is kind of just depreciating in value, sat on the driveway unused. And if you're like me, you may find that the battery's gone when you try to use it. So that's another cost that you maybe hadn't wanted to budget for. So I think the thing is that if you are having access to a range of other ways to get about, you can actually make those simple journeys to your local shops, etc., on foot or by bike. When you're commuting, if you're commuting into the city centre by public transport, maybe then you only need to have a car for kind of those longer journeys, to visit friends and family at the weekend, or to attend kind of events and things. And then you could be using other means to do that. You can be using car clubs, and rather than having a car that's sitting there tempting you to use it because you've paid for your road tax, you've paid for your insurance, and you're paying through the lease or paying off the loan to pay for it. And then you feel like you're kind of obliged to use the car and not use those other methods because you're already invested in the metal on your driveway. So I think it's a question about thinking about the way we live our lives, isn't it? And we've all had to do that over the last year. And I think this is the ideal time to be getting people to think about what changes they can make that will improve health and well-being, improve our air quality, ensure that they're more physically active, and also help us to tackle the climate emergency.
That's great. Thanks, Lisa.
Nigel, I've just seen in the chat sort of clarification of the question around car strategy. Yeah. And obviously there's two ways of looking at car strategy type questions. It's certainly in my mind, in terms of we do get lobbied by obviously people that want to use the car and have, if you like, unfettered use of using the car. And we sometimes get adverse comment about that we're too in favour of public transport, for example. But certainly within the document that Paul has alluded to today, in terms of there could well be more strategic moves that could be made to actually disincentivise car use. Workplace parking levies, such as being used in Nottingham, is something that is out there. And in some respects, some of these approaches could help tackle if it generates some sort of income, if that's acceptable. If it brings some income into the city, that might then help with some of the questions that have been asked about the cost of public transport, because it is high in places and costly for families. So that might be a way of helping that answer that one. But again, these are questions and points of view that we need to see expressed in these exercises, so that can help inform ultimately the exec board and the council in making a final decision.
That's great. Thanks, Gary. So I'm just going to remind people, there's a lot of detailed questions. We won't be able to answer those in the session today, but we will get back to you on those detail points. So we'll try and find as many of those and answer them as we can. I think one of the two questions I'd like to go to, one to you, Paul, and that's what are we doing around buses? We've done a lot as part of the LipTip programme. But clearly some of the points that Lisa outlined, making sure that they're reliable and quick is a key factor. So if you could go to that point, and then I'm going to go to Lisa, because there's a number of questions around the railways which we haven't talked about, and I'll leave Lisa to finish up the session on what we're doing with the Combined Authority around the development of rail for Leeds and its wide labour market, which it draws on people from across the north of England. So Paul, quickly on buses.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I think the point around buses is we need to get ourselves into a virtuous circle with this, where the costs of running the buses is fixed. You know, they have to pay the drivers, the buses cost money to develop, so somehow that system has to be paid for. But part of the problem that bus companies have is around the congestion that they get stuck in, and if we can resolve that by putting in bus priority, they can get the same bus round more times in an hour or a day, and that means you can run it more efficiently. And if you run it more efficiently, that's more attractive to people, and then you get more people on, and then they start paying more fares, and then those people, that more money can be reinvested either in more buses or reduce cost. And by having both of those things, if you reduce the cost, more people might use it, therefore it just keeps going in a virtuous circle. And that's where we've got to get to, and that's been the opposite story, if you like, in many cities across the UK and in Leeds over the past probably 30-40 years, in that you've had a reduction in income and things are being cut, and then that's made the service worse, and therefore it's reduced again. So we've got to turn that around, and we can either turn that around by looking at fares as and a structure for that and inputting some funding into that, or we can work on the reliability and the journey times of those buses by putting making it reliable for them through the congestion. So that's really what we've got to do with buses. I think that's a quick summation of the strategy that needs to be done. There's lots of bits go into that, but essentially, yeah, more people using them, and it keeps going up.
Good. Okay, thank you. Lisa, I've left you with another difficult one because they're always complex, these issues, but I thought it would be helpful just to say, because there's a lot of comment on rail, more detached for Leeds as a council, and but it works closely with the combined authority, but it's a complex area, it's big investment, it's long term. You know, what's the future of the railway for Leeds, and how do you see that evolving?
So I think Gary might want to come in on this one as well. So we work with the combined authority and through the leader of council with Transport for the North as well, in terms of rail investments. And we've been pushing, as you know, both for HS2 and Northern Powerhouse Rail to be taken forward. We know that if we're going to encourage people to take cleaner means of transport, that we need to have those high speed and longer distance journeys available on rail rather than flying, for instance, and particularly for journeys domestically and near European neighbours, having that rail alternative is really very important. The other thing that the investment through both of those schemes would do is to free up capacity on local rail routes, and that would then enable, for instance, areas like mine that were identified, East Isles was identified as an area, I think about 10, 15 years ago, that should be in need of a rail halt because of all of the new housing that's been built. And it couldn't be accommodated because at the time the main Leeds to London line couldn't take another halt en route, whereas with the investments in Northern Powerhouse Rail and high speed rail, you could actually increase the capacity on local routes for more local stations. What we have got at the moment, we've got planning approval for White Rose Station to go ahead, and we're in the pipeline for two further new rail stations, one out to the east of Leeds at Thorpe Park, a development that's currently very heavily car dependent, but we'll see both a park and ride and a rail halt in the future. That's alongside another large scheme of new housing. There's a swathe of 5,000 new homes earmarked for the east of Leeds. So again, really important that we get a sustainable form of transport there that can get people both into Leeds and then beyond for those longer journeys on rail. And then to the northwest of the city, we have plans for a halt at on the Horsforth line, which would be used then for those travelling to and from Leeds Bradford Airport as well. So taking some of the cars off the roads in and out of the city. We know lots of people commute into Leeds through that way. And if we can get them off the road and onto rail, that would be really beneficial, as well as the journeys that people are then taking onward from Leeds Bradford for their holidays.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Gary, do you want to add anything before I wrap up?
Well, I was busily writing some notes when I could see that question coming towards me, and you steadily ticked off all the points I was going to raise, Councillor Mulheron. The key point I'd probably just add or re-emphasise is the funding one, because we have made good progress with new stations and proposed stations coming forward. But when you talk about HS2 Northern Powerhouse Rail and Transpennine route upgrade, we're talking very significant sums that need to be invested. And clearly, if anybody's used the railways recently, well, pre-COVID, they will know that significant investment in rail track in and around Leeds is needed. And so that needs, and I'm not being political here, it just needs major investment from national government. And we need answers and certainty around that funding so that we can progress with the combined authority. They are the transport authority, the schemes working with Network Rail. But unfortunately, we just struggle to get these schemes funded in advance and some surety around it. So we could all then progress all the schemes around it that we discussed at the very outset of this meeting, because it all needs to interplay, and it's very complex on occasion. So certainty of funding going forward, and maybe the mayoral combined authority will help if there are elections in May to gain that surety of funding, but we shall see. So that's what I would add there, Nigel.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks as well, Lisa. I'm going to wrap up there because we're at the end of our hour session. We've run over a little bit just to accommodate this, the late start that we had. I just want to say thank you to all of our participants. A whole range of questions there, from very strategic to detailed design related matters, and I think it's really helpful for us to understand, and make us think about things that we might not have taken into consideration in terms of developing the strategy or the plans, or later on what's really important from a design. So thanks for helping us make sure we have as few unintended consequences, or we don't always understand what's important to local people and local businesses. I'd like to thank the panel, particularly Councillor Mulheron, whose area it is within the council and the cabinet, and to Gary and Paul and the rest of the team for organising today's session. And as Gary said at the outset, there's plenty more webinars that you can participate in. If we have not managed to get to your question, we'll try and answer some of them afterwards. Finn's just put up on the screen the forthcoming webinars, but you can see they cover all of the areas of the transport strategy, and the next one is about new and shared mobility solutions, which is on Tuesday, the 6th at 1600. So thank you for everyone, and look forward to you contributing to future webinars and also sharing your thoughts on the Connecting Leeds website as part of the consultation, which runs until I think it's the 26th of March. Is that correct?
That's right.
Oh, everyone's nodding. Yeah. Oh yeah, there you go, 26th of March. So there you go, www.leeds.gov.uk/transport conversation, all one word. And if we've not got around to your comments, please drop them into the transport conversation consultation area. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nigel.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon and stay safe. Thank you. Are we back to